The Victorians gave the world so much it is crazy, from technology to healthcare to children's rights to animal rights to so much more. They also put the finishing touches on arguably the greatest empire ever constructed, the British Empire. However, despite all the riches this brought, for the majority of those living in Victorian Britain, especially Victorian England, the story was not one of wealth, but the opposite, of horror and poverty of the most extreme kinds. Here are 4 facts that show just how extreme poverty was in Victorian England. Victorian era slums were arguably the most horrific in history. When we think of slums, we tend to think of modern day ones like the ones in Rio de Janeiro, South Africa and places like that. But modern day slums, even the absolute worst ones, are places of relative luxury when compared to the ones that existed in Victorian England. The ones in Victorian England were so horrific that often there would be thousands of people living and working in areas of typically no more than a few square miles, which in a world without working plumbing, running water and a lot of other things is on another level horrific. Here's why. If you went to the bathroom for a number 2, it was stored in a cesspit in the basement. Now imagine that many people storing their feces in the cesspits in the basement. Exactly, horrific. They became so full they basically acted as second foundation. And it gets worse. When it came to urinating, many people simply did it in the corner of a room. I'm not joking about this. Imagine that many people peeing in the corner of the room you're going to sleep in. Yep, exactly. And when I say that many people, you still haven't got the point of just how many I mean. To really emphasize just how crammed and horrific these slums were, an especially famous one was a Manchester, England one called Angel Meadow. It was nicknamed Hell on Earth, and for good reason. There were over 30,000 workers crammed into a space of just 1 square mile in size. I mean, think about that. 30,000 people living and working in a space of just 1 square mile, and not in skyscrapers. They didn't exist back then. Just standard terraced homes. I mean, think of all the urine and feces these homes would have been filled with. Imagine how horrific that would have been and would have made the living experience. And the craziest thing is, this is not even the worst example. The worst example is in St. Giles, London, where 54,000 people were crowded into just a few streets. And to really emphasize just how crammed this made the place, by one count there were 1,100 people living in just 27 terrace houses, which is more than 40 people per home. Yep, 40 people per home. And again, these were not big homes. The smallest would have had 2 or 3 bedrooms, the biggest at most 9, which meant often there would be 6 people per bedroom. Needless to say, being trapped in poverty in Victorian England was an experience arguably worse than any in history. Living space was so cramped and poverty so extreme in Victorian England that many families resorted to chucking their children out in an effort to survive. Yep, I said what you think I did. Because so many families were forced to live together in such densely packed living spaces, not only did children frequently run away because they rightly deduced doing so would give them a better chance of surviving, some families chucked 1 or more of their children out in an effort to try to save their other children. Yep, in an effort to try to save their other children. I mean, it's crazy. And the craziest thing is, as horrific as that sounds, the methodology was sound to explain children are expensive. So by throwing 1 child out, the parents immediately saved money, meaning they immediately had more money and so food that they could spend on their other children. And this is why typically the parents would throw out the child that required the most input, which would mean in the Victorian era it paid to be a cheap child, at least if you lived in poverty. And I know, imagine being in such extreme poverty, you have to think like that. The sad thing is, in some places today, some people still have to think like that. Poverty was so extreme in Victorian England, crazy numbers of women were in prostitution. In 1851, it's estimated that 1/3 of all young women in London, so women aged 15 to 25, were prostitutes. Another 1 in 3 were servants, which in many ways was tantamount to being a prostitute, in terms of why, if a male was the employer, frequently he would expect sex as part of the service. And the crazy thing is, being a servant was probably worse than being a prostitute, which is probably why so many servants left the industry to become prostitutes. And just to emphasize how difficult being a servant was, it was not just the sex. Even without that, it was crazy tough. You see, servants were expected to work absolutely insane hours, and I mean insane hours. You're talking 17 hours a day or more, and they were expected to work every every day with no breaks. And in terms of days off, maybe 1 or 2 a month if they were lucky. Yep, just 1 or 2 a month if they were lucky. Also, keeping a Victorian era household functioning was crazy difficult. Even water, only one room had water, which meant water had to be brought to and taken from every other room in the household. That made cleaning crazy difficult. Laundry, crazy difficult. Also, it meant if the employer wanted a bath, having to warm up the water, then trudge up and down the stairs again and again to fill up the bath, which would take a lot of journeys, all of which you would have to make fast enough for the bath to be warm once it was filled. Basically, the work of being a servant was so difficult and took up so much time that often women employed as servants were unable to find marriage until 35 because they never got given the time. Child labour was a real problem in Victorian England. When poverty is a problem, inevitably so is child labour, and the Victorians had this problem big style. Boys as young as 5 would work on farms, they would work in factories as chimney sweeps down in coal mines and the like, and worse, and they would often work for 12 to 18 hours a day, often 6 or more days a week. I should add, girls would also be put to work from a young age, but mostly in or around households, a relative utopia compared to the boys' tasks, though even some girls would find themselves down mines and sweeping chimneys. And I should add at this point, the Victorians knew this was a big problem and, in their defence, did try to combat it. For example, in 1840, Parliament brought into law the Chimney Sweepers and Chimney Regulations Act, which made it illegal to allow any person under the age of 21 to climb up or into a chimney for the purposes of cleaning it. Another act they brought in was the 1842 Mines Act, which banned mining companies from employing boys under the age of 10 and all women and girls. Then there was the 1850 Factory Act, which set a limit for all women and girl workers of no more than 10.5 hours a day, and there were many more acts that came along. The problem was, of course, none of them really worked that well, at least not for poor children. This is because, unfortunately, poverty was so extreme for poor children, especially those on the street, so runaways and those who had been kicked out, that these children inevitably had to work for money, meaning they had to take whatever job was on offer. The irony of this is the acts reduced the number of legitimate jobs available for children, and the result was to push a lot of children onto the growing black market and into criminality, something which is of course common for acts of the sort brought in, which are more designed to stop the symptom rather than the source. Perhaps there's a lesson there that we may one day learn. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, remember to give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because the more who do so, the more of these short histories I can make. Is that a good bribe? I hope it is. I'll see you next time.